my background is all space. So, pardon me, do I?
You've been to Colorado Springs a lot?
Well, yeah, I've lived here 3 times. So a couple times at the academy, and I've been down out at Cheyenne Mountain, and okay.
All right, good morning, men. Any ladies here? Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you're sure you're a guy. Yeah, about a half of you. That's good. That's really good. Hey, good morning. Special morning this morning. We have a special guest with us. I want to introduce you to a dear friend of mine, Dr. Jerry White, and he's going to come up in just a moment. But Jerry, I've got a bio here for him. He's brought some books also I'll tell you a little bit about. He's going to be sharing part of his story and a little bit about men and work and all of that. And I've known Jerry, I guess, for, gosh, how many years, Jerry? It goes back to when we first came here with Every Home for Christ. What year did you leave the Navigators? What that was like. It's on here. It's on the bio, but so is everything else in the world on this bio. That's what happens when you get to be old, guys. Bios look like this. Except me, mine is 1 paragraph, so I don't have to worry about it. But I'm not going to read the whole thing. But he's such an incredible man. Let me just read the first part because he's got such an interesting story. Jerry White is a president emeritus and board chair emeritus of the Navigators, an international Christian organization with over 5,000 staff ministering in 112 countries, working with college students, military personnel, business, and professional people in churches. And that he's been with them for a long time. He's an Air Force guy. He did some work with the Space Command. 13 and a half years active duty, I guess, Jerry, right, with the Air Force. He retired in July of 1997 as a major general. I won't go into a lot of these details, but he has so many wonderful awards, and I know that these are things that are very special to him. In 2 consecutive years, 67 and 68, he was awarded the George Washington Honor Medal from the Freedom Foundation. In 1990, he was awarded the Legion of Merit Medal, and in 1977, he received the Defense Service Medal. In 1991, 93, and 95, he served as chairman of the Colorado Rhodes Scholarship Selection Committee. He was formerly the vice chairman of Aerospace Education for the Air Force Association. He is on the board and executive committee of the Lausanne Committee on World Evangelism. Were you at Lausanne in, what was it, 89 or 90? Yeah, I might have seen you there too. We were in Manila. Yeah, yep, I remember that. Gosh, John Wimber was there, remember, and Hayford and all those guys. It was a great, great event. Past board of Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability and the board of World Vision, and a member of the board and chairman of the advisory council of the Christian Leadership Alliance. Some of you, if you were here for Paul Stanley's memorial service, you may have heard Jerry speak so fondly of Paul. He and Paul were such dear friends for so many years. But what he really wanted me to let you know is that he's really passionate. Every time I've been with Jerry, and I've been in a lot of different meetings with him, his main passion, guys, is what we're here for. It's discipleship. He's passionate about discipleship, and he's passionate about Jesus. And I think you're in for a real treat this morning. He brought a few books. This one, Harsh Grief, From the Agony of a Mother's Great Loss on Earth, and then Harsh Grief, Gentle Hope. And he might share, I know a little bit about this story. He might share an excerpt from that possibly. These, he would like, there's only about 6 of them, 5 or 6. They're free if you guys would like to take one. And then he has a couple of other books here, On the Job, Survival or Satisfaction. This is a book about the workplace. And then also The Joseph Road is available too. He usually gets about $5 a piece for these. If you guys have some money and you want to pick up some of these, but he indicated that if you can't afford it, he'll give them to you as well. So would you guys please give a warm welcome to Dr. Jerry White. To advance this is just right click.
That one. Got it. Thank you. Thanks. Well, good morning. welcome to the heat wave. Yeah, right. All the bugs. I don't need those. But I probably should. That's great. Well, today I'm going to take you down on a trip down memory lane. Now, my memory is not as good as it used to be, but my wife, Mary's, is perfect. And she can remember things in our history, in our marriage, that either I tried to forget or that I honestly did. But like on our first date, she remembers that I did not like pizza, and she had suggested having pizza. And I can still remember running out of gas in my old 37 Chev with her and two other women in the car on Highway 99 in Seattle, and three women had to get out and push the car in high heels. I mean, she reminds me every time the gas gets below half, I get to know about that. She also remembers our first wedding anniversary in North Texas. I don't know whether it was in Odessa or where. It was somewhere down there. She was 6 months pregnant. It was August. And we went out for this beautiful, in a pretty dumpy cafe. And she had her first experience of a cockroach about 3 inches long walking across the top of the table. So I said, happy anniversary. I mean, I could tell you story after story that I can't remember, but now she's reminded me of them later. But all of us do remember just the turning points that have come up in our lives. And if I were to sit at a table, as we will later on with you, and ask you to share what the turning points were for your life, we'd be here all day. But I'd like to just share a few of those myself. It's an interesting verse in Deuteronomy chapter 8. And by the way, let me just pray before we start. Can we just ask the Lord to bless us? Father, this is your place. We are your men. We are your people. And we want to serve you. So speak to us by your Holy Spirit and by your word today. Don't let me get in the way of that. In Jesus' name, amen. In Deuteronomy 8, it says, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years to humble you and then to test you and to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and feeding you then with manna, which neither you nor your fathers had ever heard of, and to teach you that what? Okay, quote, man does not live by what? Bread alone, but by what? Every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. So you say, anything that happens in your life, you said, God, why? Well, so that you might know that you don't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And of course, that was quoted in the New Testament. And so we want to find out what it is that God has led us on our particular journey and what he has taught us in those particular times. And so today, I'd like to just share 3 or 4 key turning points in my personal life. I grew up in a little tiny town in Iowa. Anybody here from Iowa? Nobody from Iowa. How'd that happen? I bet there's some from Texas. You know, Texas has the most small towns of any state in the nation, and Iowa is second. Well, my town was Garden City, Iowa, 100 people, total Norwegian community, and my phone number was 9. That's it. And it was a wonderful place to grow up. It wasn't so wonderful for my mother because my father left us when I was an infant and divorced her. And you can imagine what it was like in a town of 100 with a 17-year-old mom and one little kid to be divorced. I mean, the talk of the town. I still go back there. My cousins are all there. It was a disaster for her But I was raised by my mother and my grandfather, and I had a delightful childhood. I mean, had the run of the place. Everybody felt sorry for me. But then disaster happened to me when my mother remarried when I was 8 years old, and to a man that I hardly knew. I went to the wedding, and that was about it. And we moved all the way from Iowa to the state of Washington, Spokane, Washington, with a man whom I did not know, who, by the way, was a wonderful man. But he was stuck with a spoiled 8-year-old, 9-year-old kid. And we came to Spokane, Washington, and it was terrible. I mean, I had so much anxiety, I had so much, and it lasted with many, many years. I could tell you stories on the anxiety that I experienced. But here's the good that came out of it. There, a businessman and a few other business guys, just like you sitting here, decided that they needed to start a Sunday school in a little housing project, post-World War II housing project in the community center. And it was there that I began going and heard the gospel again and again and again. And finally, at age 11, I had understood it enough. Another business guy was driving us home from the lake one day and said, "Does any of you guys want to receive Christ?" I said, "I would." And I prayed to receive Christ. Went in and told my parents what had happened. They probably thought, well, this too shall pass. You know, this won't last. But that man, Bob Shepler, stayed in my life till the day he died and discipled me. I worked for him in his business. I would go back and see him when I was in the Air Force. It changed my life. Became involved in high school with Youth for Christ and made some key lordship decisions, and then went off to the University of Washington. But you see, God's sovereignty took my mother through absolute misery and totally took me out of a place where I don't know what would have happened if I'd still be back in that little town in Iowa, brought me to a place to hear the gospel. And it changed my life forever. I went off to the University of Washington. Bob drove me across the state. My parents had no idea what to do about university. And Bob told me where to live. It was there that I met the Navigators and I met my wife, Mary. And we were married before our senior year in college. And both of us working our way through school, graduated in electrical engineering, went to ROTC, immediately entered the Air Force, went into pilot training. I'm an Air Force pilot here. And flew for a year, and John here knows this story pretty well. But at the end of the year, I didn't realize I'd need to get rid of a bunch of people, and I washed out of pilot training. And I said, well, this is terrible. Here I came into the Air Force to fly. What am I going to do now? It was the first thing I'd ever failed at. And so I just told the Air Force, send me wherever you want to send me, and I'll just go there and then spend my 3 years mandatory, get out and go back for Boeing Aircraft Company where I had a job waiting for me. So they sent me to a place called Patrick Air Force Base, which was Cape Canaveral. I had no idea where it was or what it was. I had no idea it was the beginning of this space program for the United States. And I remember sitting with a personnel officer, and he told me what I was going to do. I said, that doesn't sound very good. And he said, Lieutenant, just go do it and see if you like, and then come back and see me. Well, it turned out to be a phenomenal job as a mission controller out in Central Control at the space program. And I started getting caught up in the early space program, working night and day on shots, but neglecting my family. And if we had not been believers, I think we'd have been divorced. And I came home one day to Mary, and she's crying, and she said, marriage isn't supposed to be like this. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I said, what? You're taking care of the kids? I'm going to work? We're having a great time? What's wrong? Does that have any... You kind of understand that? And God got my attention and said, you need to change what you're doing. And I was still intent on getting out of the Air Force until one day I was standing in a Saturday morning out on my lawn at Patrick Air Force Base, and my neighbor, Fred Hopewell, was out there. And I said, well, Fred, what are you going to, he's a career guy. He's Naval Academy grad, had taken Air Force for his commission. And he said, well, I'd like to go. I asked him, what are you going to do for your next assignment? I knew what mine was, is getting out of here and going back to Seattle. And he said, well, I'd like to go teach at the Air Force Academy. I have not had many times where God has spoken to me, but a switch went on in my mind. And as I talked with Mary, I got this message from God. Go teach at the Air Force Academy. And I said, how do you do that? He says, you got to get a master's degree and be selected. So then I have to get a master's degree. And I thought I'd go to the Air Force Academy and teach, reach students, and get training from the navigators, because I'd been involved with the Navs. And through a series of interesting miracles, that actually happened. And so we ended up in the astronautics department at the Air Force Academy, and just had an absolutely delightful time. And I started getting hooked on the Air Force. I said, okay, this is it. And then the Air Force asked me to go back for a PhD, and I said, absolutely not. I have absolutely zero interest. And I still remember, how many of you have been at the Air Force Academy assigned there or something? A few of you. Okay, I'm driving across Interior Drive. I'm driving down into Doug Valley. Everybody has, if you've been there, I've driven it 1,000 times. I'm coming down that hill, and God says, you didn't even pray about it. I don't want to pray about it. And I wrestle with God as I drive back home. And I told Mary that the department had called me in and said he wanted us to get a PhD. And I said, I don't want a PhD because I want to stay here. I want to reach students. And besides, I was scared stiff of going to do that because I didn't think I had the brains to be able to do it. So I went in the next morning, told the boss, said, listen, I said, I'll think about it. Now, what I meant is I'll pray about it. And God led us back to Purdue. We were having this old master's, this is a Purdue deal, and back to Purdue. Came back to the academy, teaching, and said, okay, now this is it. I'm in the Air Force for a career. I love my field. I love astronautics. My career is going well. And then the unthinkable happened. Lawrence Sanny, who was president of the Navigators at the time, he and I went for a drive up to Fort Collins one day. And as we came back, he said, Jerry, I'd like you to pray about coming full-time with the Navs. And I thought, oh, nuts. I said, that's the last thing I want to do. But way back, Mary and I had prayed, said, we'll do whatever you say, God. We'll go wherever you want us to go. So I said, okay, we'll pray about it. And ultimately, God led us to leave the Air Force, but I was very, very sensitive to the academy. I did not want to resign from the academy because it's a career place. So I said, I'm going to go to the next assignment, which was down at what used to be Old Ent Air Force Base in Cheyenne Mountain in Space Track, and worked there, ended up resigning and going full-time with the Navigator. But here's why it was so hard. I was under the deep conviction, and still am to this day, that God calls 99% of us in our work to stay where we are, to do what God has equipped us to do, whether it's in construction or in software or whatever it is, to stay there and be a witness for Christ inside. So this was tremendously embarrassing to me. And so I remember, and John was out there, and you weren't there at the same time, but I wrote a 6-page letter to all the cadets that had gone through our ministry at the Air Force Academy and telling them, don't do what I do. You stay in, and explain what God was doing in my life. It was a tough time. So went with the Navigators, and that was an issue of lordship, because you had to go on support, you had to raise your funds. It was just everything I didn't want to do. I wanted to give, I didn't want to get. And so it was embarrassing to me. I'm going to fast forward. I became president of the Navigators, promoted to brigadier general. In 1990, Mary and I were speaking at a conference, I think it was a Gaither conference back in Columbus, Ohio. And I got up one morning and my secretary, Margie, calls me and says, Jerry, I've got to tell you that your son, Steve, was murdered last night. Mary just saw my face just go white. And we just, of course, immediately got in. In fact, a guy at the hotel drove me in his open pickup truck to the airport just to try and catch an airplane and get back home. And I still go by the banks of phones at O'Hare Airport and know where I called my daughters and how we drove up to Fort Collins and picked up my youngest daughter, and the minute she got in the car, said, what's wrong? And had to tell her. And God just totally changed our lives. Our lives were never the same since then. I mean, think of success. You know, here you're president, here you're this general officer and all that stuff, and all of a sudden, the worst thing that I could think of happens in our lives. But I still remember getting down on our knees by our bed in the house we're still living in and saying, God, we don't know what you're doing, but we surrender this to you, period. Weeping. And God did. God used it in a way. I remember having to go out to Hanscom Air Force Base in my reserve assignment, and I was being transferred to a 2-star position. And we were to have the going away party. Any of you have been in the Air Force, you know what going away parties are. They're fun. They make fun of you. They tell jokes. You just have a great time. So I had about 100 people in the club there. But everybody knew what had happened. And so there was just this silent pallor over they didn't know what to say. So I got up and I said this, okay, well, thank you for all the expressions of sympathy you've given to us. You all know me. And I said, I'd like to share 2 Bible verses with you, which is kind of unusual in that situation. And I said, Ecclesiastes 7:2 said it's better to go to a funeral than to a banquet, because that is the end of every person, and the wise person will listen and learn. And I said, secondly, it says in Proverbs 14, it says, even in laughter, the heart may ache, and joy may end in grief. Those are the 2 things I shared with all my friends. And by the way, I'm in touch with so many of them to this day. It changed everything in my relationships. It changed everything in the Air Force. It changed everything with my bosses. It changed everything with the navigators, especially our international navigators, to whom I was a scary person because of my background. The military is not liked in many parts of the world. You know, it's feared. And so God used that. But God took us through it, and God took suffering and changed our lives. But he also kept me in work. And that's the last thing that I'd like to share with you, just a couple thoughts. Some other time, maybe we can talk about it in detail. I was deeply convinced that my role in life was to be an engineer, to be in my field in space, and to have a witness in the Air Force. Because if people said, where are you called? And I said, I'm called to the Air Force. But Genesis 2:15, this is the first point, and we'll talk about this at the tables. It says this, the Lord God took the man, put him into the Garden of Eden to do what? To work it and to care for it. This was before sin. Now later in Genesis 2, he says, I'm going to give you a wife. And, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And Eve was created. So the 2 things that God created before sin entered the world were work and marriage. And so That is the foundation of work in the Old Testament. There's much more. But I came to believe, and still believe, that work is a calling. God calls us to a mission and a place. You can't have a mission without a place. And for me, that place has been in the United States Air Force. He also gives us gifts and opportunities. And Colossians 3:20 says, whatever you do, do it what? Wholeheartedly, as unto the Lord, and not unto men. And then in Colossians 4:5 and 6, it says, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders, making the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation or your manner of life be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you shall know how to answer everyone. Most of my non-believing relationships are still from my time in the Air Force and beyond, because I'm continuing to keep engaged with the Air Force Association and with the space people around here in this area. And so God gives us a mission and a place. The other thing, we use the skills that God gave us. In Exodus 36, when they were building the tabernacle, you remember those passages that you always get bored at reading through and about all the stuff that they're collecting? But it's an interesting thing. But Bezalel, Oholiab, and every skilled person to whom the Lord has given skill and ability to know how to carry out all the work of constructing the sanctuary are to do the work just as the Lord commanded. In Proverbs it says, do you see a man skilled in his work? He shall not stand before mean men, but he shall stand before kings. God takes the skill that you have and brings you into place to live it out and to do it well. And for me, I believe work is a pathway for the gospel. In Colossians 4:5, remember it says, be wise in the way you act. But in 1 Thessalonians 4:11 and 12, it's an interesting verse. It says, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life will win the respect of outsiders, and so you will not be dependent on anybody. See, God has a plan, and the plan is for us to be in His place, to be His men or women, if there were women here, in the workplace, in the neighborhood, wherever it is, and to have a witness for Jesus amongst the lost. Because most of us hide maybe in a place like this, I don't know. We get into our church, we get into our little Christian community, and we lose the friendships that are out there in the world. So God has taught me over the years, and as I counsel cadets, as I counsel young people and talk to them, I said, okay, you may have discipleship and evangelism on your heart, which I do. I mean, that is a bell ringer for me. But I said, in your work, you need competence, excellence, and faithfulness. Now, I'm not going to talk any further on that. We could do that at another time if you wish. But the way you pave your way inside your work is by those things. So God calls us. God gives us a history. God gives us a turning point. And so today, that's all I'm going to share today. Today, the life implications are these. You are called. Understanding your past choices point to your future, especially in seeing where your work fits. So that's the thesis for today. So I shared with you my turning points and how God called me into the workplace, and still is. And so, given that, we are going to, let's see, I'll get it here yet. I know it'll go. There we go. Here are the discussion questions to discuss at your tables. What bad things have happened to you that brought about good? What was one turning point decision you made? How and why have you been called to the work you are doing now? And what is the purpose of work? Now, I don't care how you take those. It'll get you talking, and hopefully we'll learn something from God and from each other. So thanks much. Okay.
Just so you'll know, Jerry, when Pastor Steve or I speak here, they never applaud.
Oh, don't they?
No, no.
Well,
sorry.
okay.
Yeah. Have a great discussion, guys. Al, do you want me to announce anything with first-timers? Are we going in the other room, or are we staying?
You guys have just got a report that there's some kind of a standoff, and we don't know if there's gunfire, we don't know if there's what's going on at Briargate and Chapel Hill. So that's a mile from here. So I don't know anything. Does anybody have anything on their phone that's come through as an alert? You guys check.
See anything? I don't have any. I'll go home.
Don't go that way. North, west, east, but don't go kind of southeast. So that, I don't know what's going on. So, thanks for hearing it.
You betcha.
Hey, guys. Any first-time visitors, if you're not at the table over here, follow me. We're going to go into the library across the hall over here.
Yeah. Where at? Lewis and Clark. Yeah. Oh, Mike's still on. Let me get rid of it. They said they'd turn up.